Social problems research. Most students taking a course in social problems do not become researchers or conduct research on social problems. Nevertheless, we are all consumers of research that is reported in the media. Politicians, social activist groups, and organizations attempt to justify their decisions, actions, and positions by citing research results. As consumers of research, we need to understand that our personal experiences and casual observations are less reliable than generalizations based on systematic research. One strength of scientific research that it is subjected to critical examination by other researchers. The more you understand how research is done, the better able you will be critically examine and question research rather than to passively consume research findings. Sociologists progress through various stages in conducting research on social problems. Number 1, formulating a research question. Next, reviewing the literature. 3, defining variables. And number 4, formulating a hypothesis. Formulating research questions. A research study usually begins with a question. In some cases, researchers have a personal interest about a specific topic because of their own life experiences. For example, a researcher who has been experienced spouse abuse may wish to do research on such questions as what factors are associated with domestic violence and how helpful are battered women's shelters in helping abused women break the cycle of abuse in their lives. Other researchers may ask a particular research question because of their personal values, their concern for humanity, and the desire to improve human life. For example, researchers who are concerned about the spread of HIV infection and AIDS may conduct research on questions such as how does the use of alcohol influence condom use and what educational strategies are effective for increasing safer sex behavior. Researchers may also want to test a particular sociological theory or some aspect of it to establish its validity or conduct studies to evaluate the effect of a social policy or program. Research questions may also be formulated by the concerns of community groups and social activist organizations in collaboration with academic researchers. Government and industry also hire researchers to answer social problems research questions such as how many children are victimized by the episodes of violence at school and what types of computer technologies can protect children against being exposed to pornography on the internet. Next, reviewing the literature. After a research question is formulated, the researcher reviews the published material on the topic to find out what is already known about it. Reviewing the literature also provides researchers with ideas about how to conduct their research and helps them formulate new research questions. A literature review serves as an evaluation tool, allowing a comparison of research findings and other sources of information, such as expert opinions, political claims, and journalistic reports. Next, defining variables. A variable is any measurable event, characteristic, or property that varies or is subject to change. Researchers must operationally define the variables they study. An operational definition specifies how a variable is to be measured. For example, an operational definition of the variable religiosity might be the number one of times the respondent reports going to church or synagogue. Another operational definition of religiosity might be the respondent's answer to the question, how important is religion in your life? For example, 1 is not important, 2 is somewhat important, and 3 is very important. Operational definitions are particularly important for defining variables that cannot be directly observed. For example, researchers cannot directly observe concepts such as mental illness, sexual harassment, child neglect, job satisfaction, and drug abuse. nor can researchers directly observe perceptions, values, and attitudes. Next, formulating hypothesis. Hypothesis is a prediction or educated guess about how one variable is related to another variable. Here is an example title: High school students reporting sexual risk behaviors by sex and year. Its hypothesis is sexual behavior of adolescents has changed over the years as a consequence of increased fear of sexually transmitted diseases that such changes vary on the basis of sex. The dependent variable is the variable that the researcher wants to explain. That is, it is the variable of interest. The independent variable is the variable that is expected to explain change in the dependent variable. Independent variable is the cause. Its value is independent of other variables in your study. The dependent variable is the effect. Its value depends on changes in the independent variable. In formulating a hypothesis, the researcher predicts how the independent variable affects the dependent variable. For example, KMEC investigated the impact of segregated work environments on minority wages, concluding that minority concentration in different jobs, occupations, and establishments is a considerable social problem because it perpetuates racial wage inequality. The independent variable here is the workplace segregation, while the dependent variable is the wages. In studying social problems, researchers often assess the effects of several independent variables on one or more dependent variables. Jekylek examined the impact of parental conflict and marital disruption on the emotional well-being of the children. Her research found that both parental conflict and marital disruption negatively affects children's emotional well-being. However, children in high conflict intact families exhibit lower levels of well-being than children who have experienced high levels of parental conflict but whose parents divorce or separate. Next, methods of data collection. After identifying a research topic, reviewing the literature, defining the variables, and developing hypotheses, researchers decide which method of data collection to use. Alternatives include experiments, surveys, field research, and secondary data. Experiments. It is a research method that involves manipulating the independent variable to determine how it affects the dependent variable. Experiments require one or more experimental groups that are exposed to the experimental treatments and a control group that is not exposed. After the researcher randomly assigns participants to either an experimental group or a control group, the researcher measures the dependent variable. After the experimental groups are exposed to the treatment, the researcher measures the dependent variable again. If participants has been randomly assigned to the different groups, the researcher may conclude that any differences in the dependent variable among the groups is due to the effect of the independent variable. An example of a social problems experiment of poverty would be to provide welfare payments to one group of unemployed single mothers, which is the experimental group, and no such payments to another group of unemployed single mothers, which is a control group. The independent variable would be welfare payments, the dependent variable would be employment. The researchers' hypothesis would be that mothers in the experimental group would be less likely to have a job after 12 months than mothers in the control group. The major strength of experimental method that it provides evidence for causal relationships. That is how one variable affects another. A primary weakness is that experiments are often conducted on small samples, usually in artificial laboratory settings. Thus, the findings may not be generalized to other people in natural settings. Next, survey. Survey research involves elicit- el- eliciting information from respondents through questions. An important part of survey research is selecting a sample of those to be questioned. A sample is a portion of the population selected to be representative so that the information from the sample can be generalized to a larger population. For example, instead of asking all abused spouses about their experience, the researcher could ask a representative sample of them and assume that those who were not questioned would give similar responses. After selecting a representative sample, survey researchers would either interview people, ask them to complete written questionnaires, or elicit responses to research questions through computers. Interviews. In interview survey research, trained interviewers ask respondents a series of questions and make written notes about or tape record the respondents' answers. Interviews may be conducted over the telephone or face to face. One advantage of interview research is that researchers are able to clarify questions for the respondent and follow up on answers to particular questions. For example, some AIDS related research attempts to assess the degree to which individuals engage in behavior that places them at high risk for transmitting or contracting HIV. Street youth and intravenous drug users, both high risk group for HIV infection, may not have a telephone or address because of their transient lifestyle. These groups may be accessible, however, if the researcher locates their hangouts and conducts face to face interviews. Research on drug addicts may also require a face to face interview survey design. The most serious disadvantages of interview research are cost and the lack of privacy and anonymity. Respondents may feel embarrassed or threatened when asked questions that relate to personal issues such as drug use, domestic violence, and sexual behavior. As a result, some respondents may choose not to participate in interview research on sensitive topics. Those who do participate may conceal or alter information or give socially desirable answers to the interviewer's questions. These are an example of interview questions. Next, questionnaire. Instead of conducting personal or phone interviews, researchers may develop questionnaires that they either mail or give to a sample of respondents. Questionnaire research offers the advantages of being less expensive and less time consuming than face to face or telephone surveys. In addition, questionnaire research provides privacy and anonymity to the research participants. This reduces the likelihood that they will feel threatened or embarrassed when asked personal questions and increases the likelihood that they will provide answers that are not intentionally inaccurate or distorted. The major disadvantage of mail questionnaires is that it is difficult to obtain an adequate response rate. Many people do not want to take the time or make the effort to complete and mail a questionnaire. Others may be unable to read and understand the questionnaire. This is an example of a questionnaire. Next, talking computers. A new method of conducting survey research is asking respondents to provide answers to a computer that talks. Newman and others found that Syrians exchange program participants were more likely to report stigmatized behavior using computer assisted self interviewing, but less likely to report psychological distress when compared to face to face interview respondents. Thus, as in research in general, the reliability of data collected may depend on the interaction between the information sought and the method used. Field research. Field research involves observing and studying social behavior in settings in which it occurs naturally. Two types of field research are participant observation and non-participant observation. In participant observation research, the researcher participates in the phenomenon where studied so as to obtain an insider's perspective on the people and or behavior being observed. Palacios and Fenwick, two criminologists, attend dozens of raves over a 15-month period to investigate the South Florida drug culture. In non-participant observation research, the researcher observes the phenomena being studied without actively participating in the group or the activity. For example, Simi and Futrell studied powder activists by observing and talking to organizational members but did not participate in any of their unconventional activities. Sometimes sociologists conduct in-depth, detailed and analysis or case studies on an individual, group, or event. For example, Fleming conducted a case study of young thieves in British Columbia. He found that unlike professional thieves, the teenagers' behavior were primarily motivated by thrill seeking, driving fast, the rush of possible police pursuit, and the prospect of getting caught. The main advantage of field research on social problems is that it provides detailed information about the values, rituals, and norms, behaviors, symbols, beliefs, and emotions on those being studied. A potential problem with field research is that the researcher's observation may be biased. For example, the researcher becomes too involved in the group to be objective. In addition, because field research is usually based on small samples, the findings may not be generalizable. Lastly, secondary data research. Data that other researchers or government agencies have already collected or that exists in forms such as historical documents. For example, police reports, school records, and official records of marriages, births, and deaths. Caldas and Bankstone used information from Louisiana's 1990 graduation exit examination to assess the relationship between school achievements and television viewing habits of more than 40,000 10th graders. The researchers found that in general, television viewing is inversely related to academic achievement for whites but has little on or no effect on school achievement for Black Americans. A major disadvantage of using secondary data in studying social problems is that the data are readily accessible, so researchers avoid the time and expense of collecting their own data. Secondary data are also often based on large representative samples. The disadvantage of secondary data is that the researcher is limited to the data already collected. This is all. Thank you for listening.